Put your hands where I can see them. Now. The sharp voice echoed through the dimly lit hallway of the precinct, cutting through the stale air like a blade. The room went quiet, save for the slow shuffle of feet as she turned, her eyes locking onto the officer's rigid stance. He was gripping his baton, tapping it against his palm as if already imagining how it would feel to use it. I said hands up. You think you can just walk in here without clearance? Who the hell do you think you are? His voice dripped with authority, a practiced tone, the kind meant to intimidate. She stood frozen, not out of fear but disbelief. The weight of every eye in the room pressed down on her. A dozen uniformed officers had stopped what they were doing to watch the spectacle unfold. Some smirked, others pretended to look busy, but no one stepped in. Not a single one. Do you not hear me? Or are you just slow? The officer stepped closer, closing the gap between them. The clack of his boots against the floor seemed louder with every step. He looked her up and down, his lip curling. You don't belong here. I don't know who let you in, but you're about 2 seconds away from being dragged out of here in cuffs. Her breath hitched, but she didn't flinch. Not yet. Instead, she held her ground, even as his baton lifted slightly, a silent threat. Search her. The words cut deep. They weren't just an order, they were a declaration. A reminder of what he thought of her, what he assumed about her. The room shifted. Chairs scraped, footsteps moved closer, but it was the laughter from one corner that pierced through her composure. Better get comfortable, sweetheart. We don't do VIP treatment here, someone jeered. She swallowed hard. The officer stepped even closer, his voice low and sharp. You walk in here like you own the place. Like you're somebody. Let me guess, you're here to file a complaint about your neighbor's dog. Or maybe looking for a friend in lockup. He leaned in, his breath hot and reeking of coffee. Newsflash, this ain't a charity. You're in the wrong place. Her fists tightened at her sides, but she kept her voice steady. You don't know who I am. Oh, I know exactly who you are, he sneered. You're trouble. That's what you are. He reached for her arm, and this time she took a step back, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Don't touch me. The room seemed to freeze for just a second. Then came the laughter again, louder this time. You hear that? She thinks she's in charge. The baton lifted slightly higher. You're about to learn how things work around here. But then it happened. A voice from the entrance, a commanding voice, sliced through the tension like a knife. The room turned. Eyes widened. And just like that, the laughter stopped. What followed left everyone stunned. It wasn't just what she said next, it was the authority with which she said it. And it wasn't just who she was, it was what she represented. But the damage had already been done. The humiliation, the insults, the threats, they couldn't be erased. And as the truth unraveled, the consequences would leave the entire department shaken to its core. What happens when the person you humiliate turns out to be the one holding your future in her hands? And how far can someone go before justice demands its reckoning? This is a story about power, prejudice, and karma, a story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about authority and accountability. Stay with us, because what happens next will shock you. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and any form of injustice. This channel is a safe space where powerful stories are told to inspire change, spark conversations, and uplift voices that matter. To our Black viewers and everyone who has ever faced prejudice, we want you to know, you are seen, you are valued, and you are not alone. Now, get ready for a gripping and emotional story filled with twists, justice, and empowerment. If you enjoy it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to support our mission of telling stories that matter. Enjoy the story. The morning light barely touched the cracked concrete steps of the South Side precinct. It was the kind of place where voices echoed even when no one spoke, the walls carrying the weight of every word ever shouted within them. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a constant reminder of time dragging on in a space where urgency never slept. Officers in worn uniforms moved with practiced indifference, their boots scuffing against the tiles as papers shuffled and phones rang out in sharp bursts. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't impressive. But for many of the officers who worked there, it was home, or at least the closest thing to it. Samantha Reynolds stepped out of her car, smoothing the creases of her dark blazer. She wasn't nervous, not exactly, but there was a tension sitting heavy in her chest. She could feel it in the way her fingers tightened around the handle of her briefcase, in the way her heels clicked against the pavement a little too quickly. Today wasn't just another day. It was her first day, and first impressions always mattered. She'd learned that the hard way. Her father used to say that respect wasn't something you asked for, it was something you took. Samantha had carried those words with her through every obstacle life had thrown her way, through every condescending glance in law school, through every whisper in the academy about quotas and diversity hires. She knew how to handle judgment. She'd been doing it her whole life. But as she climbed the steps and pushed open the heavy glass doors, the weight in her chest didn't lift. The station felt different from the others she'd worked in, grittier, rougher. The officers here weren't just used to the chaos of the streets, they thrived on it. And as she walked through the lobby, she could feel their eyes on her. They weren't subtle. A tall man with a shaved head leaned against the front desk, arms crossed over a chest that looked like it spent more time in the gym than on patrol. His name tag read J. Daniels. He didn't move when she approached, didn't even pretend to be busy. Instead, he looked her up and down with the kind of confidence that came from years of getting away with it. "Can I help you?" His voice was casual, almost bored, but the edge in it was impossible to miss. Samantha held his gaze, her posture straightening. "I need to speak with the captain." Daniels smirked. "You and half the city. What's it about?" Her jaw tightened. She'd dealt with men like him before, men who measured their worth by how easily they could intimidate someone else. "It's about work." He raised an eyebrow. "Work? What are you, a lawyer? Social services? Or is this about a complaint?" The assumption stung, even though it shouldn't have. She knew better than to expect anything different. Still, she forced her voice to stay even. "I need to see him now." Daniels tilted his head, clearly unimpressed. "And I need to finish my coffee, but we can't all get what we want." Before Samantha could respond, another voice cut in. "You're wasting your time, Daniels. She doesn't belong here." A second officer, younger but just as smug, walked up and leaned against the desk beside him. Samantha's eyes flicked to his name tag, Harris. He was grinning, like this was a joke he'd been waiting all morning to tell. "Looks like someone got lost on their way to HR, Harris said, earning a chuckle from Daniels. Samantha felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't back down. She couldn't. "I'm here for business," she said, her voice sharper this time. Daniels straightened, his expression hardening. "If you don't lower your tone, I'll be the one handling your business. And I don't think you'll like how that goes." It was a threat, plain and simple. Samantha's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stand her ground. She'd prepared for this. She'd spent years preparing for this. And yet, the sound of Daniels's baton tapping against his palm sent a cold wave down her spine. "You think you're in charge here?" he asked, taking a step closer. "You think you can walk in here and start making demands?" Harris laughed again. "I say we toss her in holding until she learns some manners." Samantha opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Daniels reached out and grabbed her arm. The contact was firm, too firm. It wasn't just restraint, it was dominance, a reminder that he held the power in this room. "Let go of me," she said, her voice sharp enough to draw attention from a few of the other officers in the room. Daniels didn't move. Make me. The words hung in the air, heavier than the tension already filling the space. Samantha's pulse quickened. She could feel every pair of eyes on her now, waiting to see what she'd do next. And then the door behind her opened. The sound alone wasn't enough to break the moment, but the presence that entered the room did. Conversations halted. Movements slowed. Even Daniels released his grip, though the smirk never left his face. Samantha turned, meeting the gaze of the person who had just stepped inside. The look they exchanged lasted only a second, but it was enough. Enough for her to know she wasn't alone. Enough for her to know this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Because while Daniels and Harris saw just another woman they thought they could push around, they had no idea who she really was. And soon, they'd regret finding out. The sound of Samantha's heels echoed sharply against the cold, polished tiles of the precinct floor, each step heavy with purpose but tinged with the weight of everything that had happened earlier. The day had already stretched longer than it should have, yet the tension in the building refused to ease. The voices of officers murmuring in the background, the occasional ring of a phone, and the muffled sound of typing created a strange rhythm that only emphasized how out of place she felt. Despite her best efforts to maintain composure, the glances that followed her every move chipped away at her resolve piece by piece. She had expected resistance. She had expected judgment, maybe even outright hostility. But the open disdain she'd faced that morning had rattled her more than she wanted to admit. It wasn't just the words or the tone, it was the smirks, the laughter, the way they looked at her like she didn't belong, like her presence was an inconvenience they couldn't wait to be rid of. And then there was Daniels, the way he'd stood there, unyielding, daring her to push back, daring her to break. She still felt the pressure of his grip on her arm, the slight sting where his fingers had dug into her skin. It wasn't the pain that lingered, though. It was the humiliation. The way the room had seemed to shrink in that moment, the way every eye had been fixed on her, waiting to see what she'd do, waiting for her to fold. But she hadn't. She wouldn't. Her jaw tightened as she approached the captain's office, the frosted glass giving away only the faintest outline of movement inside. She didn't hesitate as she pushed the door open, the sound louder than she'd intended, drawing the attention of the man behind the desk. Captain Ramirez looked up slowly, his glasses perched low on his nose as he took her in. His expression didn't change, not surprise, not annoyance. If anything, it was unreadable, and that made Samantha's stomach twist just a little tighter. "You're late," Ramirez said, gesturing toward the chair opposite him without looking up from the papers spread across his desk. Samantha didn't sit. "I was delayed." Ramirez finally set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "I heard," he said, his tone neutral but heavy. "What happened?" Samantha didn't flinch, but her voice came out sharper than she'd planned. "Your officers happened. Daniels put his hands on me." Ramirez let out a long breath, leaning back further in his chair as though the weight of the room had just doubled. "Daniels is a good cop," he said, his voice low and measured. "He's been here for years. He knows this place inside and out." "That doesn't excuse what he did," Samantha said quickly, cutting him off before he could finish the thought. "I don't care how long he's been here or how good of a cop you think he is. He crossed a line. And it won't happen again." Ramirez's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something else in his expression, concern, maybe, or warning. "You need to listen to me," he said, his voice dropping. "This precinct isn't like the others. The men here, they're close. They trust each other because they have to. These streets are different. The rules are different. And whether you like it or not, they see you as an outsider." Samantha felt her pulse quicken, but she held his gaze. "Then they'll have to get used to me." Ramirez leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Respect isn't given around here. It's earned. And whether you're right or wrong, walking in the way you did this morning, you didn't earn it." Samantha's shoulders squared. Respect isn't optional. Ramirez studied her for a moment longer before leaning back again. Then you better be ready for what comes next, he said. As Samantha left his office, the words echoed in her ears. But she didn't let them sink in, not completely. She'd faced obstacles before. She'd been underestimated her entire career, and it had never stopped her. It wasn't going to stop her now. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but the tension in the building never eased. Samantha could feel it in every room she walked into, every conversation that paused just a little too abruptly when she entered. And Daniels? He made sure she felt it. He seemed to appear wherever she went, leaning against walls, watching her with that same smirk he'd worn in the morning. By the time the precinct had started to empty out, Samantha's head was pounding, but she wasn't ready to leave. She sat at her desk, flipping through case files, but the words blurred together. She couldn't focus. Not with the weight of everything hanging over her. And then she felt it, that presence, the shift in the air before he even spoke. Burning the midnight oil already? Daniel said, his voice casual but laced with something darker. Samantha didn't look up. What do you want? Daniel stepped closer, resting his hands on the edge of her desk. Just checking in. Making sure you're settling in all right. I'm fine, she said, keeping her voice cold. Good, he said, his smile widening just slightly. Because you've got a lot to learn about how things work around here. Samantha finally looked up, her eyes locking onto his. Like what? Daniel shrugged. Like knowing who to trust. And who not to cross. Samantha didn't blink. Is that supposed to scare me? Daniels leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Not scared. Good. Then maybe you'll be smart enough to listen. And then he was gone, leaving Samantha staring at the empty space he'd left behind, her pulse pounding in her ears. She flipped through the file again, her fingers moving faster now, scanning dates and reports, looking for the pattern she'd seen earlier. And when she found it, her stomach dropped. Daniels wasn't just arrogant. He wasn't just cruel. He was hiding something. Something big. Samantha locked the file in her drawer, her hands trembling slightly as she stood. She wasn't ready to confront him yet. Not without more proof. But the pieces were starting to fall into place, and the picture they painted was darker than she'd imagined. The station felt heavier as she walked toward the exit. The silence wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. But she didn't look back. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow, everything changes. The sound of Danielle's voice carried through the hallway before Samantha even stepped inside. It wasn't loud, but it had weight, the kind that filled every corner of a room and demanded attention. She paused just outside the door to the squad room, her hand tightening briefly on the file she carried. Inside, voices layered over each other, officers laughing and chatting, their guards down now that the day was winding to an end. But Danielle's voice cut through it all, sharp and deliberate. So, what? We're just supposed to take orders from her now. Just roll over and act like none of this matters. He paused, and Samantha could almost picture the way he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, daring anyone to disagree. Because I'm not buying it. She's not one of us. Never will be. Samantha stepped inside, and the shift in the room was immediate. Conversation stalled mid-sentence, heads turned, and Danielle's smirk faded just slightly. But he didn't stand. He didn't move. Instead, he leaned further back, his eyes meeting hers like he'd been waiting for this moment. Something you want to share with the rest of us, Daniels? Samantha's voice was steady, but her pulse quickened. Daniels didn't hesitate. Just making sure we're all clear on how things work around here. And how is that, exactly? She stepped closer, forcing him to sit up just slightly. It's simple, Daniel said, his tone casual but sharp. Respect is earned. Not handed out with a badge. Samantha held his gaze, refusing to look away. You think this is about respect? Danielle's eyes darkened. I think this is about you walking in here and pretending you belong. The room was silent, every officer watching, waiting. Samantha took another step, closing the space between them. Pretending? She dropped the file onto the desk in front of him. Because I'm not the one who's been pretending, Daniels. Am I? His expression didn't change, but the flicker of tension in his jaw told her she'd hit a nerve. She tapped the file once, her voice dropping just enough to make the room feel smaller. These reports, she said, paint a very different picture than the one you've been selling. Suspicious arrests. Missing evidence. Complaints that never made it past your desk. Danielle's smirk returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're grasping at straws. Samantha opened the file, flipping to the first page. Am I? Because this isn't just one case, Daniels. It's dozens. Patterns that go back years. Reports signed off by you. She pushed the page closer to him. You think no one would notice? That no one would ever put the pieces together? Daniels leaned forward, lowering his voice. You don't know what you're talking about. But I do, Samantha said, leaning in closer. I know about the witnesses who recanted their statements after you paid them a visit. I know about the suspects who mysteriously disappeared before making it to court. And I know about the money, the kind that doesn't show up on your pay stub. A ripple moved through the room. Chairs creaked, papers shifted, but no one spoke. Danielle's smile was gone now, replaced by something harder, colder. You're out of line, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Samantha didn't back down. No, Daniels. You're out of time. For the first time, Daniels hesitated. It was small, a flicker in his expression, a brief glance toward the other officers, but Samantha caught it. I know what you've been doing, she said, her voice steady. And I'm not the only one. The IA report is already in motion. You're done. Daniels stood, the legs of his chair scraping against the floor, but Samantha didn't flinch. You think you can just walk in here and tear this place apart? His voice rose, and the tension in the room snapped like a live wire. You don't know what it's like out there. You don't know what we deal with every single day. You sit behind a desk and think you can judge me? Samantha's voice cut through his. This isn't about the job. It's about you abusing it. Danielle's fists clenched at his sides, but before he could speak, another voice broke through the tension. Enough. Captain Ramirez stood in the doorway, his face set like stone. Both of you. My office. Now. The room didn't move as Samantha followed Ramirez, Daniels trailing just behind. The captain's office felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in as the door shut behind them. Ramirez didn't sit. Instead, he leaned against the desk, his arms crossed. What the hell is going on? Samantha was the first to speak. I have evidence. Enough to open an investigation. Daniels stepped forward. It's nothing but accusations. She doesn't know what she's talking about. Ramirez's eyes shifted between them before settling on Daniels. Is that so? Daniels didn't answer. Ramirez let the silence stretch before speaking again. Do you know what this looks like? Do you understand what this means? Danielle's voice dropped. You're going to take her side? After everything I've done for this department? This isn't about sides, Ramirez said. It's about facts. And right now, the facts don't look good for you. Danielle's voice cracked. You're making a mistake. No, Samantha said, stepping forward. You did. The words hit harder than she expected. Danielle's shoulders sagged, but the anger in his eyes didn't fade. Samantha didn't look away. She couldn't. Not now. Ramirez finally broke the silence. Daniels, you're suspended. Effective immediately. Hand over your badge and weapon. The air in the room shifted as Daniels froze. You can't do this. I just did, Ramirez said. Daniels' hands trembled as he unhooked his badge and set it on the desk. When he looked up at Samantha, his voice was quiet but sharp. This isn't over. Samantha held his gaze. Yes, it is. As Daniels turned and walked out, the tension didn't break. If anything, it thickened. Ramirez's voice was calm but firm. You'd better be right about this, he said. Samantha nodded. I am. And she was. But she also knew that this was just the beginning. Daniels' footsteps echoed down the hallway, heavy and deliberate, but Samantha didn't turn to watch him leave. Her eyes stayed locked on the badge and weapon sitting on Ramirez's desk, the symbols of authority that had just been stripped away. The room felt suffocating now, the tension lingering even as the door clicked shut behind Daniels. Ramirez exhaled slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose before looking up at her. This isn't going to be clean, he said, his voice low and weighted with something that almost sounded like regret. You know that, right? Samantha's fingers dug into the edge of the desk as she nodded. I know. Ramirez straightened, pacing slowly to the other side of the room. Daniels has friends here. A lot of them. You think they're just going to let this go? She met his eyes, her voice steadier than she felt. I don't expect them to. But this isn't about them. Ramirez let out a dry, humorless laugh. It's always about them. About us. About the way we close ranks when the walls start closing in. You've been here long enough to see it. Samantha didn't blink. And that's exactly why it has to stop. The captain's shoulders stiffened, and for a moment, she thought he might argue. Instead, he turned back toward the desk, his hands bracing against it as he leaned forward. This isn't just about Daniels anymore. You know that, don't you? She swallowed hard but didn't hesitate. Yes. Ramirez nodded slowly, almost like he was convincing himself. Then you'd better be ready for what comes next. Before Samantha could respond, the door burst open. Officer Harris stood there, his face pale and his breathing uneven. You need to see this, he said, his voice urgent. Ramirez's head snapped up. What is it? Harris hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Samantha before landing back on the captain. Just, come now. The hallway was buzzing with voices before they even stepped out of the office. Officers clustered around computer monitors, whispering and pointing, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. Samantha pushed through the crowd, her heart pounding. What's going on? She demanded, but no one answered. Instead, Harris grabbed a remote and pointed it at the TV mounted on the wall. The screen lit up, and the sound hit her first. Danielle's voice, loud, angry, and unmistakable. The video played on a loop, a shaky cell phone recording that captured the confrontation from earlier in the day. Samantha's stomach dropped as the footage showed Daniels grabbing her arm, the sneer on his face, the way his baton hovered just inches from her. The audio cut in sharply. You're about to learn how things work around here. The words hit like a punch, even though she'd already lived through them. Samantha's eyes scanned the crowd, reading the reactions, discomfort, shame, some anger, but no one spoke. Ramirez's voice broke the silence. Where did this come from? Harris cleared his throat. It's everywhere. Someone must have leaked the security footage. It's all over social media. The weight of the moment pressed down on Samantha, but before she could speak, the door to the precinct slammed open. A reporter pushed through, microphone in hand, followed by a camera crew. The chaos erupted instantly. Lieutenant Reynolds, can you comment on the video? Is it true Officer Daniels has been suspended? Is this part of a larger investigation into corruption in the department? Ramirez stepped in front of her, raising his hands to block the cameras. No comments right now. This is an active situation. Samantha's pulse raced as the questions kept coming, each one louder than the last. But it wasn't the reporters that shook her. It was the look on the faces of the officers she passed as she pushed through the crowd: resentment, anger, betrayal. Back in Ramirez's office, the door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the noise, but the tension followed. Samantha paced, her breath quickening. "This is spiraling out of control," Ramirez said, his voice tight. "No," Samantha snapped, spinning to face him. "This is exactly what needed to happen." Ramirez's eyes narrowed. "You think this helps? You think this makes it better?" "I think it forces accountability," she shot back. "And that's the only way things change." He stared at her for a long moment before shaking his head. "You just lit a match in a room full of gasoline." Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. It was Harris again, his face even paler than before. "You need to come back out here." Ramirez didn't move, so Samantha pushed past him, her heart hammering as she stepped back into the chaos. The crowd had shifted, and at the center of it stood Daniels. His face was red, his eyes wild as he shouted over the noise. "This is a witch hunt," he yelled, his voice raw. "They're setting me up. I've given everything to this department, and this is how I get treated." The room vibrated with tension, officers torn between stepping back and stepping in. Samantha moved toward him slowly, her voice cutting through the noise. "Daniels." He turned on her, his fists clenched. "You did this. You did this to yourself," she said, her voice calm even as her pulse pounded. "You think you're untouchable." Daniels hissed. "You think you're better than me?" Samantha held her ground. "No. But I'm not afraid of you." The words hit him hard. For the first time, Daniels faltered. But only for a moment. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice trembling. Samantha stepped closer. "Yes, it is." The sound of Ramirez's voice cut through the tension as he called for officers to escort Daniels out. The room shifted as Daniels was led away, his shouts echoing down the hallway. But even as the door closed behind him, Samantha knew the battle wasn't over. She could feel it in the weight of the stairs, the murmurs that hadn't stopped. Daniels might have been removed, but his presence lingered like smoke. Ramirez's voice broke through her thoughts. "You'd better be ready for the fallout." Samantha's chin lifted. "I am." And she was. But as the precinct buzzed with tension and unanswered questions, she also knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning. The station felt different now. The tension hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. It was heavier in some ways, quieter in others, like the air before a storm. Samantha walked through the hallways, her steps measured, her gaze steady, but the weight of what had unfolded hung on her shoulders. Daniels was gone, but his presence lingered, etched into every corner of the precinct. Conversations hushed when she passed, and glances darted in her direction, quick and guarded. Some were curious, others hostile, but the one thing they had in common was uncertainty. No one knew what would happen next, and the unknown was far more dangerous than anything they had faced so far. She stopped outside Ramirez's office, her fingers tightening briefly around the doorknob before pushing it open. He was there, standing behind his desk with his arms crossed, staring at the evidence folder she had left earlier. He didn't look up right away, but she could feel the tension radiating off him. When he finally raised his eyes, they were tired, but not defeated. "We've got a problem," Ramirez said, his voice low and steady. Samantha stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "Only one." Ramirez didn't smile. Instead, he pushed the folder toward her. "Daniels isn't the only one implicated in this mess. We've been digging deeper into those reports, and it's worse than we thought." Her stomach tightened. "How much worse?" Ramirez hesitated, but only for a moment. "Enough to bring this entire department under investigation." Internal affairs is already involved, and the press isn't letting up. Daniels is just the beginning. Samantha leaned against the desk, her thoughts racing. She had known this wouldn't end with Daniels. She had suspected from the start that whatever was happening here ran deeper, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill down her spine. "What about the others?" she asked. Ramirez shook his head. "Some are clean, but others," he trailed off, and the silence said more than words ever could. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. "We can't stop now. If we back down, we'll lose any chance of fixing this." Ramirez's eyes darkened. "Fixing this might not be an option anymore. We're talking about years of corruption, cover-ups, and abuse. This department's reputation may not survive it." "Then maybe it shouldn't," Samantha said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Maybe it's time we stop protecting what's broken and start building something better." Ramirez didn't respond right away. He studied her, and for the first time, she saw something shift in his expression, respect, maybe, or something close to it. Finally, he nodded. "Then you'd better be ready for what's coming." The words hung in the air as Samantha left the office. The hallway felt even heavier now, the weight of every step pressing down on her. She knew Ramirez was right. This wasn't going to be clean, and it wasn't going to be easy. But it had to happen. She reached her desk, flipping through the reports again, looking for patterns, connections, anything that might help her piece this puzzle together. But her focus kept slipping, her thoughts drifting back to Daniels, his words, his threats, the look in his eyes as he was escorted out. The precinct wasn't safe yet. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced down at the screen and felt her pulse quicken. It was Harris. "Meet me in the parking lot," his text read. "Now." Samantha didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and headed for the exit, her mind racing. Harris had been quiet since the fallout, keeping his head down and staying out of the chaos. For him to reach out like this meant something was wrong. The parking lot was dimly lit, the flickering overhead lights casting long shadows across the pavement. Harris was leaning against his car, his face pale and his hands buried deep in his pockets. "What's going on?" Samantha asked, her voice low. Harris glanced around before stepping closer. "You need to be careful," he said. "This thing with Daniels, it's bigger than you think." She crossed her arms, trying to keep her voice steady. "I already know it's big. Tell me what you know." Harris hesitated, his eyes darting to the shadows before settling back on her. "There's talk. Some of the guys, they're not happy about what happened. They think you went too far. And Daniels? He's not done. He's still got people here, people who don't want this investigation going any further." Samantha's heart pounded. "Are you saying they're protecting him?" Harris nodded. "They're scared. If Daniels goes down, so do they." Her stomach twisted, but she didn't let it show. "Then we keep pushing." "You don't get it," Harris said, his voice rising. "This isn't just about covering tracks. These guys are dangerous. Daniels might be out, but his influence isn't. And if you keep pushing, they're going to push back." Samantha stepped closer, her voice cold. "Then let them." Harris stared at her for a long moment before shaking his head. "You don't get it," he said again, quieter this time. "Daniels isn't afraid of losing his badge. He's afraid of losing everything. And that makes him desperate." Samantha's breath caught, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Thanks for the warning. Just be careful," Harris said, stepping back toward his car. "Because this? It's far from over." Samantha watched him leave, her thoughts swirling. Harris was right, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And as she stood there in the dim light of the parking lot, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on her harder than ever. She turned back toward the precinct, her jaw tight and her step steady. "Tomorrow, everything would change. But for now, all she could do was prepare for what was coming. Samantha stood at the edge of the parking lot, the glow of the streetlights barely reaching the cracked pavement beneath her feet. Her breath hung in the air, faint and fleeting, but her thoughts were anything but. Harris's words still echoed in her mind, sharp and heavy, leaving a weight she couldn't quite shake. She'd expected backlash, expected resistance, but the intensity of it, the undercurrent of fear and desperation, was something she hadn't fully prepared for. It wasn't just Daniels anymore. It was the system he represented, the foundation of alliances and secrets that had kept men like him untouchable for so long. And now that foundation was crumbling, piece by piece, and Samantha could feel the cracks spreading beneath her feet. She took a breath and turned back toward the building, her eyes scanning the shadows as she walked. Every creak of the wind, every shuffle of gravel felt heavier now, like it carried something unseen. But she didn't slow down. She couldn't. Her hand lingered briefly on the door handle before she pushed it open, stepping back into the fluorescent hum of the precinct. The air inside felt just as charged as the night outside, and the eyes that flicked toward her as she walked through the hallway made her skin prickle. She wasn't imagining it. The tension was thicker now, more focused, and the whispers followed her like a shadow. She spotted Ramirez near the entrance to his office, his arms crossed and his expression grim as he spoke to one of the officers. When he saw her, he motioned her over without a word. She approached quickly, her pulse quickening as she read the look in his eyes. It wasn't panic, but it was close. "We've got a problem." The words hit harder than they should have, but Samantha stayed steady. "What kind of problem?" Ramirez lowered his voice, glancing toward the hallway behind her before answering. "Daniels didn't go home. He's been seen outside. Twice. Watching the building." Samantha's breath hitched, but she forced herself to stay calm. "He's trying to intimidate us." Ramirez's jaw tightened. "It's more than that. There's talk that he's been making calls, stirring things up. He's got friends here, Reynolds. People who still answer when he calls." She swallowed hard, her voice dropping even lower. "Have you talked to IA?" Ramirez nodded. "They're aware, but it's not enough for an arrest. Not yet. They need more." Samantha's fingers curled into fists at her sides. "So we give them more." Ramirez's eyes darkened. "You don't get it. This isn't just about evidence anymore. It's about control. Daniels lost his badge, but he hasn't lost his influence, and that makes him dangerous. If you push too hard, he's going to push back." She met his gaze without flinching. "Then let him." Ramirez studied her for a long moment before exhaling sharply. "You really don't scare easy, do you?" "Not anymore." He almost smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Then you'd better be ready, because if Daniels makes a move, it won't be subtle." Samantha turned away before he could say anything else. The hallways felt even heavier now, the weight of every glance pressing down as she made her way back to her desk. The reports were still scattered across the surface, but they felt different now, less like evidence and more like a warning. The pieces were there, but they weren't enough. Not yet. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. The number wasn't saved, but she recognized it immediately. Daniels. She stared at the screen, her pulse pounding in her ears. Then she answered. "You think this is over?" His voice was sharp, but there was something else beneath it, something raw and fraying at the edges. "It is over." Daniels laughed, but it was hollow. "You're in over your head, Reynolds. You don't know what you've started." "I know exactly what I've started." His voice dropped lower. "Then you'd better watch your back, because you have no idea what I'm capable of." She didn't flinch. "And you have no idea what I'm willing to do to stop you." The line went dead, but the words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Samantha set the phone down slowly, her hands steady even as her heart raced. She knew it wasn't just a threat. Daniels was desperate now, and desperate men were dangerous. She barely noticed when Harris appeared at her desk, his expression tight and anxious. "We need to talk." Samantha looked up, reading the urgency in his eyes. "What is it?" Harris glanced around before leaning in closer. "I heard something. Daniels isn't just talking, he's planning something. I don't know what, but it's big." Her stomach tightened. "How do you know?" "Because I heard it from someone I trust. And they said it's happening soon." Samantha's pulse quickened. "Then we stop it." Harris hesitated, his voice dropping. "You're not listening. Daniels isn't alone in this. He's got people helping him, people on the inside." Her breath caught, but she didn't let it show. "Then we find out who they are." Harris shook his head. "It's not that simple. These guys, they don't talk. They protect each other. Not anymore." She stood, grabbing the files and locking them in her drawer before turning to Harris. "Tell Ramirez to pull the logs. I want to know who's been talking to Daniels since he left. And get IA back on the line. We're not waiting for this to come to us." Harris nodded and disappeared down the hall, but Samantha stayed still for a moment, her mind racing. She could feel it, the pieces closing in, the tension tightening like a wire about to snap. Daniels wasn't going quietly, and the fallout was only just beginning. She stepped away from her desk, her footsteps echoing through the emptying halls. The shadows felt heavier now, the walls closer, but she didn't slow down. She couldn't. Because somewhere out there, Daniels was waiting. And whatever he had planned, she was ready for it. Samantha stood in the dimly lit office, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above her barely cutting through the heavy silence. The tension pressed down on her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. Harris's words lingered in her mind, each syllable a reminder of how far this had spiraled. Daniels wasn't acting alone. He had allies, inside the precinct. The thought twisted in her stomach, but she forced herself to stay focused. She couldn't afford to let fear creep in. Not now. Not when everything was about to come crashing down. Ramirez stood by the window, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as he stared out at the parking lot below. The faint glow of streetlights cast long shadows across his face, deepening the lines that worry had carved into his features. He didn't turn around when Samantha spoke. "We can't wait any longer." Ramirez's voice was low, but there was no mistaking the edge in it. "You think I don't know that? Every step we take from here has consequences, Reynolds. You need to be ready for that." "I've been ready. What I'm not ready for is giving Daniels time to regroup." Ramirez finally turned to face her, his eyes heavy with something she couldn't quite place, doubt, frustration, maybe even fear. "And if this blows up in our faces?" "It won't. You don't know that." She stepped closer, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "Then we make sure it doesn't." Ramirez didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for the phone on his desk, dialing quickly before pressing it to his ear. His voice dropped as he spoke, and Samantha strained to catch the words. IA was already pulling records. Calls. Logs. Everything. But Ramirez wasn't just talking about Daniels anymore. He was talking about the others, the officers whose names had started surfacing in connection to the missing evidence and false reports. When he hung up, his shoulders were tighter, his voice lower. "They're closing in, but it's not enough yet. Daniels knows it. He's stalling, buying time, and we're giving it to him. Not anymore." Before Ramirez could stop her, Samantha was out the door, her steps sharp against the floor as she headed back toward the squad room. The eyes that followed her this time weren't just wary, they were guarded, defensive, and she felt it with every glance that lingered a little too long. Daniels had gotten to them. She could feel it. The uncertainty. The hesitation. The fear. Harris caught up with her just before she reached her desk, his voice low but urgent. I pulled the logs. There are calls. Meetings. Daniels has been busy, and not just with the guys here. He's reaching outside the precinct. Her stomach dropped, but she didn't let it show. Outside to who? Harris hesitated. That's the problem. Some of the numbers are burners. No way to trace them. Then we need to flush him out. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Samantha turned, her eyes locking onto his. We push him. We make him desperate enough to slip up. Harris's expression darkened, but he didn't argue. He knew as well as she did that waiting wasn't an option anymore. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Reports were re-examined. Files were double-checked. Every move Daniels had made in the last 6 months was dissected, but the pieces weren't coming together fast enough. Samantha could feel it, the pressure mounting, the clock ticking down, and with every passing hour, the sense of control slipped further through her fingers. By the time night fell, the station was quieter, but the tension was still there, humming just beneath the surface. Samantha stayed at her desk, her eyes scanning the files in front of her until the words blurred together. She didn't look up until she heard the door open. Ramirez stepped inside, his face tight. We've got movement. Her pulse quickened. Where? Warehouse District. Daniels was seen there an hour ago. Samantha grabbed her coat. Then let's go. Harris joined them as they headed out, and the drive to the warehouse was filled with silence. Samantha's fingers gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white as she replayed everything in her mind. Daniels wouldn't go down quietly. She knew that. But she also knew he'd underestimated her. And this time, he wouldn't see her coming. When they reached the warehouse, the air was thick with tension. The building loomed in front of them, its windows dark and empty. Ramirez motioned for them to split up, and Samantha nodded, her heart pounding as she moved toward the side entrance. The door creaked as it opened, and the darkness inside swallowed her whole. She moved carefully, her flashlight cutting through the shadows as her pulse echoed in her ears. The sound of footsteps made her freeze. Danielle's voice broke the silence. I was wondering when you'd show up. Samantha turned, her flashlight landing on him. He stood at the far end of the room, his arms crossed and his eyes cold. You should have walked away, Reynolds. And you should have stopped while you had the chance. Daniels laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think this is over? It is. He stepped closer. You really think anyone's going to believe you? After everything I've done for this department? For this city? Samantha didn't flinch. The evidence speaks for itself. And what about you? He took another step. What happens when this comes back on you? When the people you're trying to protect turn on you? I'm not afraid of them. Maybe you should be. Samantha tightened her grip on the flashlight. You don't scare me, Daniels. He smirked. You should be. Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the building, and Ramirez's voice cut through the tension. It's over, Daniels. Danielle's eyes darted toward the entrance, and for the first time, Samantha saw the flicker of fear beneath the anger. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by the same cold defiance. You're making a mistake. No, you did. The sound of handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the room as Daniels was led away, his voice fading into the night. But Samantha didn't move. She stayed there, her breath steadying as the weight of everything finally started to sink in. Ramirez's voice broke through her thoughts. It's done. Not yet. She turned, her eyes locking onto his. This is just the beginning. The precinct was quieter than it had been in days, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that came after a storm, heavy and thick, filled with debris that hadn't settled yet. Samantha sat in Ramirez's office, her hands resting on the edge of the desk as she stared down at the reports in front of her. Daniels was gone. Officially terminated. The charges against him were already making headlines, and the fallout was spreading faster than anyone could contain. Officers were being questioned. Files were being pulled. It wasn't just Daniels who had fallen, it was everyone connected to him. And yet, Samantha couldn't bring herself to feel relief. Not yet. Ramirez leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. You should take a break. Go home. Get some sleep. She shook her head, her voice steady. I can't. Not until I know this is finished. Ramirez sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. It is finished. Daniels is out. The others will follow. IA is all over this. Samantha looked up, her eyes sharp. That's not what I mean. You saw the way they looked at me out there. This isn't just about Daniels. It's about everything he stood for, everything he let fester in this place. Ramirez nodded slowly. And you think you can fix it overnight? No, but I'm not going to stop until it's done. He studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. You're not wrong. But you need to remember, this isn't just a fight. It's a war. And wars take time. Samantha's phone buzzed before she could respond. She glanced down, her stomach tightening when she saw the message. It's done. Daniels has been transferred. She exhaled, letting the weight of those words sink in. It's done. But the words didn't feel as final as they should have. Ramirez's voice broke through her thoughts. You did good, Reynolds. Better than most would have. She looked up, the corners of her mouth tugging into a faint smile. Thanks. By the time she left the office, the station had emptied out. The halls felt bigger without the usual chaos, but Samantha didn't mind. She needed the quiet. She stopped by her desk, gathering her things before heading for the door, but Harris caught up with her before she made it out. I thought you'd already left. I was about to. He shifted awkwardly, his voice quieter than usual. I just wanted to say, you were right. About all of it. Samantha raised an eyebrow. That's not something I hear often. Harris almost smiled. Yeah, well, don't let it go to your head. I won't. But thanks. He nodded, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes she hadn't before, respect. Real respect. Not the kind that came from fear or obligation, but the kind that had been earned. She walked out into the night, the cool air hitting her skin and pulling her back into the moment. The city felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing, she wasn't afraid of it. Daniel sat in the holding cell, his hands cupped in front of him as he stared at the wall. He looked smaller now, like the weight of everything he'd built was finally pressing down on him. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something hollow and broken. He didn't look up when the guard walked in, didn't flinch when the cell door opened. Time's up. Daniel stood slowly, his shoulders sagging, but there was no fight left in him. He knew this was the end. And as he was led away, the echo of his footsteps fading down the hall, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd done this to himself. Samantha watched from the other side of the glass, her expression unreadable. She didn't feel sorry for him, but she didn't feel victorious either. This wasn't about winning. It was about doing what was right. And sometimes, that didn't come with celebrations. Back at her apartment, Samantha sank into the couch, the exhaustion finally catching up with her. The case was closed, but the work wasn't over. It never would be. There would always be another fight, another battle to face. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for it. And maybe that was enough. This story isn't just about corruption. It's about the power we give to people and what happens when that power is abused. It's about standing up even when it's hard, even when the odds are stacked against you. Because sometimes doing the right thing doesn't come with applause. Sometimes it comes with resistance, with anger, with fear. But it's worth it. And maybe you've been in a situation where you felt powerless, where someone tried to make you feel small or invisible. Maybe you've questioned whether speaking up is worth the risk. Let this story be a reminder that it is. That the truth matters. That justice matters. What would you have done if you were in Samantha's shoes? How far would you go to protect what's right? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's start a conversation about accountability, about change, and about what it really means to fight for justice. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us here at Tales of Twist. We're just getting started, and there are so many more stories to tell. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.